You've been watching on the left a Pathé newsreel from 1965 showing the RISD factory which made Matchbox Cars, which was a really proud moment for England. It was the most successful manufacturing company in England, and it really single-handedly helped them recover from World War II and reestablish their sort of sense of identity. And on the right are Viewmaster slides that were produced to promote Barbies, first in retail stores and then later just in children's imagination. So I just wanted that there to give you a sense of where we're going. And I'm really grateful to be here because for years at the Faculty Biennial, I just make a thing and put it in the show because the show is for things. So I can make things, it represents what I do, but it doesn't really reflect what I'm doing professionally. And I really wanted to support this forum by participating because I think there is a huge percentage of our population that doesn't make objects and still is involved in design and the creative effort. So I wanted to show you what I did do last year. I had a one-year project working on a show for the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida, called Wheels and Heels. And it was a history of Barbie dolls and Matchbox cars. And I worked on it for a whole year. So I feel like this effort is much more representative of sort of what I've been doing professionally than if I just made yet another hammered lamp with some funny quotation on it. There are a lot of conversations that could be possible. These are just pictures of the show. I could talk about how to put a show together, the curation that's involved, how to plan a show with sight lines, and what to do with a 30-foot ceiling. I could talk about sort of new methods of research where eBay becomes a research tool because you're not supposed to do that. But it turns out it's really useful. So there were a whole bunch of things I could have talked about, and I feel like it was my job to come here and say this is what I did on my summer vacation. But the reality is putting that show together brought some ideas about design to the surface for me that couldn't be part of the show. This was supposed to just be fun and lightweight and amusing and communicate some information. But there's a lot to learn about design by looking at this project. So I wanted to bring that to the surface because I feel like for the RISD community, for design people, there's some cooler stuff that the rest of the world wouldn't care about. The show had about 1,000 objects in it. There were, I think, 350 actual Barbie dolls, and it was just a lot of stuff. And as a result, I got all of it. We purchased it all on eBay, if you can believe it. And so all of it passed through my hands, and I got to handle the stuff, which you usually don't get to do. And as a result, how it's made and the story the objects told on their own became more interesting than the information I was finding in books. So I read 34 books about Barbie and learned a lot about Barbie. But I learned way more about Barbie by wondering, why is the foot chewed off on this doll? So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about design and its requirement that it predict use. I'm going to start and end with some pages pulled from the History of Industrial Design class I'm currently teaching. Walter Dorwintig is one of the earliest industrial designers by profession, and I think one of the most important because he was really smart and really well educated. And so his ideas about what design was going to become, for me, are a little more meaningful. And in 1940, he wrote a book called Design This Day, and he talks a lot in that book about the Industrial Revolution as a dividing point, where before that, if you made wooden bowls and your bowl wasn't good, you could make a better bowl. And it was iterative, and the craftsman would just make better and better things. But once the Industrial Revolution happened, one person would decide what the bowl looked like, and other people would make it. So if it didn't work well, that information wouldn't probably get back to the designer. We tend, since the Industrial Revolution, to sort of have one shot. You can design a bowl, and we'll make the bowl, and if it's terrible, we'll just blame you, and we'll move on to some other designer and some other thing. That idea that designers need to predict use, instead of 100 years of evolution to get the best teapot, I have to throw everything I can at fixing this teapot before it gets made. So we start doing things like looking at users and the size of a hand and style preferences, and you try and incorporate all of that before the thing gets made. So when it gets made, it has a longer lifespan. What happens, obviously, when designers make mistakes has consequences. Yeah. Sometimes when a designer doesn't predict use correctly, it's not safe. I mean, it's amusing, but perhaps not safe. But there are a lot of different ways that can manifest itself. Sometimes designers just don't look at the complete spectrum. So here's a really lovely scissor design where they realized if we make the blades come apart, you can clean them, you can get the gunk off of them, you could wash the bacteria off of it. But they didn't test it on big enough hands. So when someone with a large hand opened the scissors, they unhinged. That's a great example of someone doing a pretty responsible job with all the aspects of design. They just didn't look at the whole range of hands closely enough. So that idea of sort of predictive imagining as part of the design process is something that really became evident working on this show. Because the only places I could see where designers get the luxury of constantly revisiting and revising is in the toy industry. And it's actually not true anymore. But from the 1890s on, toy companies would continue to revise their toys for a new market and with new technologies. So that idea of an opportunity to keep revising, partly to match changing styles, changing materials, changing manufacturing techniques, and partly to respond to the completely brutal attention of children, is something that became really evident looking at these objects. What I want to do is show you some examples of what I sort of imagined as a back and forth. We've designed an object, we send it out in the world, we get feedback about what we did wrong, and we fix that. And in fixing it, we invent a new problem that we couldn't have predicted. It's like a ping pong game. And the Barbie story was sort of rich with examples. So almost every solid vinyl doll I got was missing something. And the eBay community was really clear in their descriptors. They used things like no pinpricks, no green ear, no chews, no bites, no pen marks. And I found myself realizing the pattern in this language, thinking, why would so many of these be bitten? And of course, it's because it feels great to chew fingers off a vinyl doll. We don't want to see that in a museum, right? We want perfect in a museum. So the dolls missing feet got boots, the dolls missing fingers got gloves, the dolls with bad hair got hats. It was a really fun job to hide the effects of use, when in fact, for me as a designer and as someone who just likes to look at design, that's what I ended up loving. I don't care about Barbie, I don't care about Matchbox Cars. I would like to erase all that stuff from my brain and move on to important things like learning more about the Kardashians. But the reality is I kind of fell in love not with Barbie, but with the kids. There's this evidence 50 years later of who that child was by what they did to their toys. And I also bought some things from their original owners. So Bernice McClure sold me her 1964 new Dream House. And when I took it apart to clean it and replace the missing parts, all of the slips of paper where she was learning to write in cursive had been shoved in the kitchen. That idea that these objects so tell the story of their owners it's not part of why we value them, and that was fascinating to me. I'll dial it back a little just to give you like a 101 in 2 slides. Ruth Handler was wife to Elliot Handler. The two of them started Mattel together in the 40s, and she watched her daughter Barbara playing with her friends, and what they wanted to do was imagine themselves as fashionable teenagers, and the only tools to do that were really cheap, flimsy paper dress-up dolls. And the only other dolls available were non-posable, they didn't have rigid joints, and they usually had clothing sewn on them, or the others, the bigger ones on the right, were what I consider to be an absolutely terrifying hybrid of grown-up lady cocktail dress, like sexy lady cocktail dress with baby face and grandma hair. Really disturbing, very expensive. They didn't lend themselves to imaginative play, and she realized they had an opportunity to really change that and give girls what they wanted, which was a way to project themselves into their own future. And so this is the first Barbie, who looks very alien to us because we don't know Barbie as that anymore. But the pattern drawing I show on the left, because the whole goal was to make this durable, to make joints where the legs and arms could be posed and the head could move. And it sounds easy to us looking back, but in 1957, when they started this, that was radical. We did not have manufacturing techniques that would allow that to happen. So there's a huge amount of engineering. But none of that mattered. That's not what they were promoting. They were promoting the clothes. The whole program of Barbie was buy one doll. She came in a bathing suit with sunglasses and high heels. And these really beautiful fashion illustrations were used to show the different outfits. And part of the plan was look at the illustration, imagine the reality. It was getting kids to sort of participate in apparel design and the fashion world. And so there are the actual outfits that came from those drawings. The doll sold for $3.99, so they didn't make a ton of money on those. They were very expensive to make, but they realized that that would get children hooked. And the clothing was $1.50 to $4, and you could get an endless supply. So parents were cursing Ruth Handler from the very beginning for introducing that idea to toys. By 1998, they had made more than 1 billion outfits. Mattel was the 3rd largest clothing maker in the United States by 1965. So it was not just a small idea, this was a really successful business plan. But then, as I said, these first dolls got into children's hands, and suddenly the manufacturing challenge, how do we make such a small thing in plastic, which we didn't know how to use well, with features that are abstracted but realistic, with joints that move, all of that was a technical challenge. And they realized that technical challenge in a brilliant way, and then kids started using it and showed them what they had done wrong. The plan backfired in a couple of funny ways. One, they sold 300,000 Barbies in the first year. I mean, Ruth Handler knew that kids would want it, and she worked really hard to convince all the men. The whole toy industry was men, and poor Ruth Handler was screaming, my daughter, can't we make her a doll? She was right, and they really struggled to make enough dolls to satisfy that. It took them 4 years to fill all the initial orders. But really the challenge was, how on earth do you make 300,000 pairs of fitted jeans with zippers, with a size 0 zipper invented just for Barbie? So what they did over time, this is that cause and effect, they looked for ways to stay fashionable and stay current and represent the times in miniature, but with fewer components, with less sewing, with fewer seams. And so when I got this clothing in and had, yes, I learned how to iron very small things. You know, to press one of these dresses, you start to realize, wait a minute, this is one piece of fabric cut into an amazing pattern and stitched into a three-dimensional shape. And then as time went on, they just continued to reduce the amount of stuff you needed to communicate the style. And that was aided by the fact that our own fashions were changing, right? Dresses started becoming just a tube with some straps. But over time, it gets really radical. So in 1972, when Malibu Barbie, which by the way was the first doll to be just a blonde, all the Barbies before that were redhead, brunette, or blonde. But Malibu Barbie, she's from California, she's tan, she's blonde. She also can't be bothered with shoes because she lives on the beach, but she still has high-heel feet, which is fascinating. And then Superstar Barbie is essentially wearing a polyester tube with a piece of Velcro in back, so there's no need to make a fitted garment. You just stick it in back and do your best on your own. That change in how they made the clothes really reflected partly, we have to make more money, we can't make such complicated things, but mostly it was a response to sort of the fixing the problem with the success of what they were doing. But for me, the real revelation was the hair, because it was important to them that the doll have what looked like real hair, and it was made of saran fiber, which is soft but a little bit brittle, and it's very, very fine. And they figured out this crazy manufacturing challenge of how to put hair on a doll this size. Dolls had hair before this. The Madame Alexander dolls had very complicated hair, but it's a wig. Those dolls with the pretty lady cocktail dress and the baby face, you could take their hair off also. At any rate, they wanted the hair to actually be attached. So it's sewn onto the head and then glued in place, because why would you ever want to change this lovely, youthful ponytail? The end is actually dipped in glue and rolled, and that's how they fixed the manufacturing. But what's really interesting to me, and I had to go do, this is what we do at RISD, right? I had to do drawing to understand this. The whole pattern where the hair comes out was sort of fascinating to me. That's the pattern of stitching where Barbie's hair came out. And yes, that's actually her profile. That's a side view elevation of a Barbie head. People complain that Barbies now don't look realistic enough. I would argue they're a heck of a lot closer than they used to be. If you think about it, if you're trying to manufacture a doll the cheapest way you can, but have it look the most expensive possible, this hair stitched just around the perimeter and then pull back to a ponytail, which is the farthest distance away from those holes. That's the smartest way to use the least amount of fiber and make the fullest head of hair. There's only one layer of hair. You can see it parting at the back of her head there. There's one layer of hair on her head, but it looks like a full head of ponytail hair. I think Donald Trump could learn from this. Here comes the surprise. This is, it's a 1961 Barbie, but it's that same hairdo, a lovely Titian. They called the redhead a Titian. And what started out looking like this, either with the curls or with the hard roll, very, very quickly, when a preteen got her hands on it, turned into this. There isn't a living child who could avoid the temptation of doing this to their doll, right? Because you don't know it's bald underneath. You just think, I want to brush your hair out. I want to give you a fancy hairdo for evening wear. And you couldn't undo the ponytail, so they'd cut it off. And then it's too short. And then they'd realize, I have this horrible, horrible looking thing. That's actually one I bought on eBay, if you can believe it. And in case you're worried, don't. She got a full restoration job in my kitchen and turned into Evening Splendor, 1961 ponytail doll. So she's in good shape now. This is not a skill I saw coming. Like Matthew Bird at 8. What are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to learn how to repaint Barbie makeup and comb their saran hair out. That was a huge problem they didn't see coming. They thought, we got it solved. We made hair. It's awesome. And then they realized, whoa, this is not a business plan. In 1961, so just 2 years later, they worked for 2 years to figure out how could we have a different approach to hair. It's much thicker strands and much more rooting. So there's that whole pattern there. Totally different whole pattern. Much more hair, much more sewing, much more labor, much more time, much more expense. The reality is they fixed one problem, but they introduced this new one. So partly it's more expensive, but even worse, does she look 17? No, she looks 50-ish. They still sold 6 million of them in 4 years, so wildly successful. And then they realized, we've got this new problem, which is she looks too old. How can we make her look young? They gave her a more youthful hairdo, but if you pull her hair back, she's facelift Barbie. Because it's very expensive to make a steel mold to mold these dolls in. And they had molded that the scar is actually the stitching line to show stitchers where to put her hair. They changed her hairline, but they couldn't invest the money in new molds just for that one doll. So they just used the same doll with a new hairline. Pull her hair back, it's terrifying. And the reality is, they didn't fix the hair problem until 1967, so it took them 10 years of playing to get synthetic hair that was durable enough, that was straight, that wouldn't kink up at the ends, that could be stitched all over the head but not too densely, that you could run a comb through. Because they realized, children taught them, that hair play was half of why anybody wanted Barbie. And it turned into a whole separate division of the company just to explore how you could give a kid hairstyling. Any one of these I could go on like for the rest of the day. I could show you the styling mannequin head that I affectionately started calling Hooker Hair Barbie, because I decided she was so tacky looking, I decided to give her the worst hairdo she could have, as an extreme of where that led. But there's so many other weird stories. And another one would be that in order to make these, they introduced Japan to rotational molding. World War II taught us to use plastics, and all the way through the 50s and 60s, we were trying to repurpose what we learned from World War II in terms of plastic technology. And rotational molding was brand new in 1957. In fact, what Dick May, the engineer at Mattel, did was take a plastics engineering magazine with him to Japan that described rotational molding. They'd never seen the machine. And the Japanese company that was making the dolls read the article and said, yeah, we could figure that out. And they reinvented rotational molding in Japan just for Barbie. Here's a quick video. It's not of Barbie. It's the best video I can find you that explains the technique. Lots of molds that have a hollow cavity. Liquid plastic is pumped into the molds, usually a bunch at once. And then heat is applied below. And then the molds are rotated, so centrifugal force spreads that liquid plastic around into all the cavities. And that's how you get really, I know that's so disturbing. I mean, human birth is bad enough, right? Let's just skip that. That's how the heads were made. They're hollow. But the limbs were made the same way. It's vinyl. They're solid vinyl. And that rotational force would force the plastic all the way out into the extremities of the fingers and toes. As a result, you could have these incredibly refined fingers. I mean, to make a tiny little plastic hand with separated fingers is astounding. You could also have a beautiful mani-pedi situation, right, where there's molded toenails and fingernails, and you paint them up and it's all pretty. But the problem with that is that these are all straight leg dolls. They're solid plastic. So there's a hip joint, which has a sort of a plunger joint, and it rotates. And that was amazing enough, and you could pose them, but they can't really sit. You can rotate the legs forward, but it's a pretty awkward situation. Even though Barbie got a dream house in 1961. I know. I feel like I shouldn't even be talking. I should just show you pictures. The story tells itself. They sold a house with furniture for her to sit on, but that's what she looked like sitting. And also she has fitted jeans. Well, anybody who's worn fitted skinny jeans knows if you can't bend your knees, don't sit down. The challenge became very quickly, they realized kids want more than just put clothes on. They want to replicate their life with their Barbie. They want to project themselves into situations. So the race was on in the engineering department to figure out how to make the knees bend. And this was a part where I was forbidden from putting too much technical stuff in the show. Just quietly posted some patent drawings in the backgrounds here and there. But for me and for this community, this is where it gets really good. Dick May, who was a brilliant engineer and a very colorful person, spent 4 years just trying to figure out a joint system. And on the right, you can see essentially she gets an interior skeleton. It's a moving knee joint that goes click, click, click. It's a ratchet system. And there's a hole in the bottom of her foot, so when the knee bends, the skeleton can stick out the bottom of her foot a little bit when the leg gets shorter. And then there's a soft outer leg over that. I think Leonardo da Vinci would be horrified by this understanding of nature. Nudity alert. Here's the straight leg Barbie. That's what she could do. And the bending knee Barbie allows something way more exciting. She still only barely can sit, but she can sit. She can cross her legs. That was amazing. So for me to see that children required this and designers had to figure it out, is the beauty of the design process. But then they had all these new problems. The soft plastic, it's vinyl with a plasticizer added, couldn't be molded in the same kind of detail. So the foot goes from being this beautiful pedicure situation to being a hatchet foot, right? It's like carved by, I don't know, dog teeth or something. And also it's a squishy, soft plastic. The funny thing is the shoes on the left are the original Barbie shoes, an open-toe, high-heel shoe, and her hard plastic foot sort of clicked in. You could not squeeze these soft feet in if you try. They offer resistance. It's like the Cinderella's stepsisters. You can't get them on. They suddenly realized they had to make all new shoes for Barbie. They needed a closed-toe shoe that gripped on the heel more than on the toe. That can't be something that they wanted to have to do, all new shoes. But the real revelation, and this is disturbing, is that soft plastic is so satisfying to chew. It's, dogs like chew toys, but so do we. And so almost every old bending knee Barbie doll I got had some condition where the skeleton was poking through because somebody had chewed it. So I had to epoxy them and tape them and put them in boots and stuff. So they can't have known that we tend to blame designers when there's a problem with an object. Like, look at these stupid designers. Who would make a doll where you chew their feet off? But the reality is, they did the best they could to predict the solution to the problem at hand. They probably couldn't really have expected that would be the new problem they inherited. That back and forth was so evident in all the Barbie dolls I got. Every single doll I got that was damaged, I did like a mental condition report and then went on a hunt to figure out, how did this happen to you? And is it a pattern? And the same thing can be looked at with the Matchbox Cars. It's a similar story. It's a small family-owned company that existed during and right after World War II, and one of the owners realized his kids didn't have the toys they needed to become better adults. And Jack Odell, the really brilliant engineer at Lesney, made for his daughter a miniature road roller, a paving roller. There were lots of metal cars that were bigger at the time that were sold at specialty stores and high-end toy stores, and they were expensive because die casting metal was a difficult process at the time. And he made a miniature for his daughter to take to school, and everybody wanted one. And he realized scale is a big part of what fires our imagination. And the bigger the truck, the cooler it is small. They repurposed what they were doing and started making smaller toys, smaller cars. And the goal was the best possible detail with the manufacturing techniques they had. And they had tremendous success right off the bat with this. But they also identified some really interesting problems. And theirs tend to be more marketing problems because their platform was working from the packaging backwards. They had the size of the box, the Matchbox size. Everything had to fit in it. As a result, there's no scale to Matchbox Cars. A truck and a car are the same size. They have to fit in the same box. And metal was expensive. So they had to try and use the least amount of metal to make the smallest possible car that still fired our imagination the same way. And they realized a couple of things. Bright colors make something seem bigger. So these are not actually the colors those trucks were, but it's going to make the piece seem more substantial, so you feel like you're getting your money's worth. And that was really important to them because this is one of the first toys sold directly to children. You didn't pester your parents to get it for you at Christmas or your birthday, which is traditionally the only time toys were sold. They were 18 cents. A kid could buy it with their pocket change at the corner store. These weren't even sold at toy stores. They were sold at corner stores. That idea of perception and perceived value, it works with us, right? We always think about, is this worth the money you're asking me to pay for it? But a kid with 20 cents in their pocket, you're going to spend 18 cents of it on a truck. You really have to be careful. And it was so successful that by 1969, they sold more than 600 million vehicles. They were producing 5.5 million a week. Yeah, I mean, we could also spend all day talking about how they figured out the manufacturing to do that because they invented all of it. Die casting existed before them, but they introduced methods of casting metal that we are still learning from that made their way into plastics manufacturing and everything else. Important part of the story of how England recovered from World War II by using manufacturing to stimulate trade. The equation started to be, how can we make fewer parts, thinner wall castings, more detail with less tooling cost? And for me, that was fascinating to see. The bus on the left, it's one of the most iconic Matchbox cars. It's the only style that was in production the entire length of their company. It was only 3 castings, 3 parts that snapped together. No glue, no welding, just press fit and some paint. And then on the right, they kept revising and revisiting that. They also realized when they first started that they were responding to a landscape which was, Britain had been so damaged during World War II that there was rebuilding everywhere. All the roads were being repaved. there were construction vehicles everywhere. And so they assumed that's what they should replicate. Kids want to rebuild their world. And they very quickly realized that kids wanted more than that. They wanted the whole world. They wanted every vehicle. So they started trying to figure out how at that same scale, at that same level of detail, they could make much more complicated vehicles. A car with curves everywhere is going to take more tooling savvy than a bus that only has a couple of curves. They sold more VW Bugs in the 4 years they were available than VW did in 50 years. They also started to sell globally, and that really changes a company's opportunities, but also constraints. That happened with Barbie as well. When you start selling Barbie in other countries, you're accountable for satisfying their expectations, those cultures' expectations. Matchbox realized that around the world, we didn't know what a Morris Minor was, and we didn't care. But we did know what a Ford was in America and what a VW was in Germany. So they started having to make new models specifically for other countries. And for me, there were also lots of construction details that were subtle advances. So the oldest cars, on the top you can see the tractor with a crimped axle. It's essentially a nail that goes in from one side, so the head of the nail holds that wheel on, and then you just smack the other side and distress the metal and it holds that wheel on, and also produces a really sharp edge. Probably not the best thing on a small children's toy, but that was the only way they could figure out how to make it. And then over time, they conquered the press that would dome the other side over. They also realized paint should be lead-free for kids. So all the way back in 1954, Lesney formulated lead-free paints for their toys. And that was before governmental restrictions. That was just, we have to do this. But it completely changed the cost of the paint, the way the paint had to dry, how it was sprayed on. So they invented all new machinery just for that. And then the real challenge actually came from Barbie's company. Mattel introduced Hot Wheels in 1968. It's one of the most famous stories in the history of toy design. Matchbox for 14 years had been making realistic replicas of big vehicles, tiny, and that was enough. What kid could want more? I've got my car, I can push it around, I'm happy in the backyard. By 1968, largely because of Barbie, Mattel was much more tapped into the youth culture and what was happening in the 60s, and they realized that kids were way more savvy. They wanted speed. They wanted bright colors and crazy, irrational approach to objects. Hot Wheels are not about replicating a real vehicle. They're about having frictionless wheel that can roll. So when you push a Hot Wheel, it goes flying. The Matchbox cars, you had to keep pushing. They just moved. They didn't go. All of a sudden, overnight, Matchbox was as good as out of business. What they did as a stopgap measure was just say, let's take our cars and put frictionless wheels on them. And they spent 2 years and many millions of dollars getting that done as fast as they could. They almost went under. They almost went out of business. So it's kind of an amazing story of tenacity and success, but it's also a really good example of what happens when you forget to predict, when you stop looking ahead, when you think what I've done is the right answer, so I'll just keep doing it. These are before and afters of the first round of superfast cars where they just figured out how to put new wheels on. But the reality is that was not going to be a long-term solution. So they re-examined how the cars were made completely, and they realized that the undercarriage could be simplified. They could make just a handful of different castings, one plastic insert that goes on all those castings for the wheels, and they could have fewer parts. They could spend more money on those parts because the frictionless wheels were expensive and the plastic part was expensive, but they could save money elsewhere by having just a couple of bases that fit on everything. You can see with your own eyes, the wheels are in different places, right? So goodbye accuracy. You can't have a car look like its grown-up version because the wheels have to be wherever the base puts them. Suddenly, they were not in the business of reality anymore. They were in the business of fantasy and speed. And all of their designs reflect that. Their superfast cars, the second round of them, start to be fantastic, and ever more so as time passed. They got more chrome, more crazy engines, more weird driver's heads sticking out the middle of the orange car. They got names like the Whoosh and Push, totally irrational, wonderful names. It's kind of a classic design trick, right? Like, I can't make it fit, so I'm going to distract you by putting shiny stuff on it. Both companies lasted for about 50 years with a lot of integrity and a lot of focus on what they were doing. And I think it's easy to romanticize these objects, and everyone was critical of my efforts to put the show together because we didn't talk about body dysmorphia. We didn't talk about the gender divide created by Barbie. We talked about racial divides a little bit, but mostly it was the story of how these things happened. And it wasn't meant to be a loving ignoring of the ugly side. But the reality is, I think that's something we put on these things later. It's very easy to look at the history of Barbie and say, what an unhealthy body image to promote. But for me, the bigger story that I think for us is sort of more interesting is that these toys gave me evidence that use allows an understanding that design isn't any one effort. It's not a light switch that you flick and you're done. A problem's never really investigated and then solved. A solution is proposed, and then you test that solution. So one thing I think we do pretty well at RISD is talk about this idea of iteration, that you propose your solution and you use the scientific method. You get people to test it, you measure your success or failure, you revise, and you keep doing that until you have the best success you can manage. So for me, watching how these toys got ruined, it's not so much evidence of where designers failed as it is evidence that we as humans invent tools. That's what makes us humans, really. That ability to take something and find our own personal use for it. This is not a ruined heel. It's a toy for investigating what it feels like to choose stuff. And that's not something I feel like I should hold Mattel's designers accountable for having invented. That wasn't where they were going. I was looking for a last slide for this talk, and I realized I got a phone call, and I picked up my Orico phone, which is, I am stupid/lucky enough to have a landline and a vintage Orico phone on the bedside table next to my bed. I want the luxury of the lifestyle these posters promise. And it was a miracle. It was the first one-piece phone. It was remarkable engineering to get all the electronics of a phone in one piece that you could pick up. There was no other part below. The off button is when you put it down. The dial is hidden below. And it's something that only the Swedish at the time could have figured out for us. It also is sculpturally innovative. It's a beautiful, compelling object, right? That the picture on the upper right is saying, you'll want to welcome your host to your party, but that beautiful phone is lurking right around the corner to keep you company when they're gone. Or it's so, don't worry, I'm still here. So it's sort of like everything a phone could be in 1954. It was the future of phones, and the designers were aware that they were making an object that said, whole new thing. This is what a phone is going to be. The reality is, it's one moment in phones. Phones have been a lot of things for a long time, and every single person who designed a phone thought that they were conquering what a phone could be and making the best thing that there could be. But that iterative process of looking down the road as far as you can possibly look and introducing methods of testing behavior and manufacturing and all the things we think about and taking some risks to predict the future is important. Raymond Loewy was aware of this, so he knew if I understand history, I can understand the future better. And he made these really engaging evolutionary charts where he went through the history of an object sort of as silhouettes and looked for a pattern. And my favorite one is the silhouette of a women's clothing. He predicted the miniskirt in 1933 because he just said, look what's happening. Hips are going, bust is going, narrower, less fabric, it's going to go miniskirt. He did the same thing with phones. He drew what phones were, and so his time, 1933, is right there. And he said, well, clearly they're getting smoother and unified. It's turning into one shape. He didn't quite get cell phone. He still was stuck with that one part comes off the other part, but definitely a predictive skill. I sort of want my plea to the non-designers in the room to have some patience with designers living that we live in one moment, we live in one strata of an evolution, and we're sort of doing our best to look at that stuff behind and look ahead, and sometimes we get it right. But there is a real frustration in our modern world. How do I use this remote control? I can't. It's a bad design and it's a bad designer. The reality is there wasn't a designer. It was an engineer, it was the buttons we could buy, it was the circuitry we could have. It's the best we could do. So I'm not saying don't be frustrated with those remotes. But for all the designers, I sort of feel like this is my plea to look ahead as far as possible. And don't look down the one road, look down lots of roads, because we live in a world where we're starting to collage different tracks into one object. And when design proves imperfect, it's often actually as perfect as we can get it to be at the moment. And there's a great quotation from Charles Eames that I came across this summer, which I've been thinking about nonstop. It's my excuse for everything now. He wrote, "The best you can do between now and Tuesday is a kind of best you can do." You know, you have a deadline, you make sacrifices, you come in with something not quite finished, but do it knowingly, do it knowing that you couldn't finish and you made some choices in the process instead of just, it's still wet. It's also a great way to think about the design, that it's now to Tuesday is days in a week, but 1930 to 1980 is another version of that. That's what I wanted to bring from the content of the show, and what I have for the background is just pictures of the show that are just going to rotate. I'm certainly happy to take questions, and I feel like I sort of did us a disservice by not talking more about that because it's really cool. But I just thought for the RISD community there was a layer of thinking that the show put into my brain that I wanted to share instead of just pictures of some other museum. Thank you very much.